This is Betatron, Investing in Asia, a podcast for people who want to invest in Asia's future. We're talking about Asia outside of China, where 44% of the world's population lives. They are young, they're digital natives, and their buying power is increasing by the day. I'm your host, Arshad Chowdhury, a partner with Betatron Venture Group based in Hong Kong. In this episode, we meet Dr. Parag, a geopolitical scholar and best-selling author of 6 books. He's the managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm, and his most recent book is The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. This episode is a must-listen for anyone investing in the region and even for anyone living here. We cover the Asianization of the region and the world. We look at the historical context of Asia's growth, consider the challenges of climate change, and we look at where future growth will come from in Asia. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Parag.
Hey, Arshad. Great to be with you.
So, Parag, you and I met back in the early 2000s in New York City, and I think you were at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I was at Deutsche Bank. And back then, at least to me, it felt like New York City was the center of the world. It was the intersection of finance and culture. There was so much happening. But now, fast forward about 20 years, and both of us are in Asia. You're in Singapore, I'm in Hong Kong, and we're both raising families out here. So you've traveled to 150 countries. That's what I've read. And I'm curious, how do you feel about settling down in Singapore versus other places in the world?
Well, I guess we're living proof that the future is Asian, or rather that the present is Asian. It wasn't more than a few years after we met that I started writing my first book, and one of the first, mega cities in Asia that I spent a fair bit of time was Shanghai. And I remember being at this garden party outside of what's called the Metropolitan Planning Museum in Shanghai. It's where they have this 3D scale model of the entire city and the whole master planning, and every building is like a little Lego piece. And the thing is the size of the floor of an entire building. So it's this massive scale model of Shanghai. And it hit me at that party and looking at that model that Shanghai was becoming the New York of the Orient, surpassing Tokyo in terms of economic importance, and the way in which they had just master planned it all. It struck me that that evening, none of the people at that event, whether they were Chinese or foreigners, felt that they were not in the center of the world, that they were not at the best party going on in the world on that day. And that was 2005. So I think that we've been in this transition for a long time. The only question is, when did it occur to you? When did it hit you like a ton of bricks? And that was the moment for me. It still took another 7-8 years for me to move to London, and then from London to move to Singapore. But now here we are. And compared to other places, as you mentioned, I do study this closely, and I make my decisions based on my empirical investigations and my travel. And we could be anywhere. We could be in New York still. We could live in London. We could be in Dubai. We could be in Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore. This place, I would say, is objectively the kind of the capital of Asia, as I like to call it. Obviously, neutral crossroads. It's English speaking. It's a global financial center.
And by this place, sorry to interrupt, by this place, you mean Singapore?
Exactly. Yeah. So it really ticked all the boxes for us. And I'm not the kind of person who's going to really stay put anywhere. So there must be something that keeps us not only here, but coming back whenever we go away.
I've been coming back and forth between the US and Asia for many years, often going to Bangladesh, where I've got my ancestral roots, but inevitably we travel around the region. And something that always surprised me was how no matter where I was, I'd be kept awake by the sounds of construction early in the morning, late at night. And coming from Connecticut in the US, where I was born and raised, I don't know the last time a new building was built in Hartford, Connecticut. So it's very different in terms of the energy. But let's talk about Asia broadly. And I guess we should start by just defining it. What is the correct definition of Asia? And is that the same region that you talk about in your book, The Future is Asian?
It's a great question, and it is the most fundamental one, truly, because the last 20 years of books about Asia have skewed us towards thinking of Asia synonymous with China and Greater China. And there is only one correct geographical definition of Asia. It's the one that all geographers use, myself included, and that stretches all the way to the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. So Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, these are all Asian countries by geography. Of course, when we talk about Turkey, don't we often say only 1/10 of Turkey's geography is European and the rest is Asian? That means it is in Asia, but we just haven't had a comprehensive geographical approach to Asia. And it was crucial to point out that even if parts of Asia had been under colonial tutelage and the colonial experience for centuries. After the end of the Cold War, over the last 30 years, so much changed. You started to see the gravitational pull of Asia, really the centripetal force that pulled West Asia in towards East Asia and South Asia. You saw it in commodities flows, infrastructure projects, all the construction you were talking about, the Belt and Road Initiative, the trade agreements, obviously foreign investment and sovereign wealth funds co-investing across this geography, Russia getting pulled in, Australia getting pulled in. Every corner of the geographic Asia now deals more with other Asian countries than it does with the rest of the world. So it's taken 20 of the last 30 years to completely reverse the centrifugal forces of colonialism and pull Asia back together. And a lot of people call that the process of the new Silk Roads. Call it what you want, but Asia is something more coherent now than it has been in 500 years since colonialism began.
You've described that process also as Asianization, or at least maybe you can unpack that term for me. What does Asianization mean to you?
First and foremost, Asianization is exactly, or part one, pillar one of Asianization is the geographic Asia becoming more Asian. Again, that gravitational pull. So that has been underway for 30 years, and it's really taking off. Because now, and let me point to very concrete episodes, the 98 Asian financial crisis, the 2008 global financial crisis, and the 2020 pandemic. 3 episodes in the last 3 decades, Asians have really demonstrated that when push comes to shove, when there's a crisis, they realize that they have to integrate more with their neighbors. They have to take advantage of the complementarities with each other's economies. They have to exchange more land, labor, capital, technology, and so forth. And that's what they've done. You saw rapid reforms after the 98 crisis. You saw rapid trade integration after the GFC because there was a global demand shock. And now with the pandemic, look what you've got. You've got the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership ratified in the midst of a pandemic. You know, in Western economies, they were talking about walls, borders, and protectionism. The largest trade agreement in human history was signed in the middle of the pandemic by Asian countries. Arshad, that's not an accident. That's by design. What happens in a crisis when globalization is constricted is you look to your neighbors and you integrate more. And that's Asia being smart and resilient. Let me just quickly say the second part of Asianization is the Asianization of the rest of the planet. It's the Asianization of Europe, of Africa, of South America, and North America. And I go into that in the book chapter by chapter, showing the metrics and the anecdotes and stories and the ways in which you see that happening. It could be obviously greater trade with Asia, greater investment from Asia, more migrants coming from Asia, talents and skilled workers, learning Asian languages, culture, food, number of Asians who are winning Western prizes, Nobel prizes and this kind of thing, literature prizes. In every conceivable metric, you see this Asianization underway.
I see that there is a tremendous amount of trade between Asian countries. Any pairing you choose, the numbers are increasing double digits, whether it's Bangladesh to Vietnam or India to any of its neighbors and so on. But I also see a disturbing trend of militarized borders. Last time I was in Bangladesh, I saw in the headlines that there were dead bodies at the border between Bangladesh and India, people who were shot trying to pass across a now militarized border. And now between India and China, there's quite a bit of tension. So are these temporary blips? Where do you see the tensions at the border, the rise of nationalism going, and where does it fall into Asianization?
You know, we can't generalize about borders globally. We have more borders than ever in history right now. We have 200 sovereign nations. That's far more than ever in history. It's 3 times more than we had after World War II. So we're still in this process of nationalities, ethnicities, and groups seeking to codify and control their own territory. Some of these tensions, such as between India and China, date back centuries. Some of them obviously date to the immediate decolonization era in the 30s, 40s, and 50s as South Asian, Southeast Asian borders started to get settled. One by one, though, they get settled. It can be violent, it can be peaceful. There have been a lot of peaceful border agreements as well. Actually, when the Soviet Union collapsed, China settled outstanding border disputes with about 10 countries immediately. And there's maritime disputes that get settled, such as between Malaysia and Indonesia. But then there are still struggles. India and Pakistan, obviously. India and Bangladesh. On the one hand, they've actually reached out to each other very significantly on commercial ties, infrastructure projects, and so forth. But on the other hand, they do want to be very, very careful about demographic flows. I mean, look at how many countries have lost control of their monetary policy, their interest rates. You can't control the flow of pandemics or cyber hacks across your borders. The one thing left in the whole world is controlling people crossing borders. There isn't really even that much left of sovereignty beyond that. So it's just hypersensitive with the ethnic composition of Indian states, West Bengal, and so forth. So that helps to explain that and put it in context. Remember, there are pretty much zero major hostile border wars going on right now in the world. Think about that for a second. Zero. Russia has taken Crimea and it's over. So they fought a war. It lasted a couple of weeks. It's over. So that's really not the big story in the world today. And then let's remember, for every example of a border conflict, there's all of the cases of borders coming down. Southeast Asia, 700 million people, free labor mobility. I mean, who would have thought, especially given how much inequality there is and tension there is and concerns about drug trade and all these other things. The counterexamples, look at Africa. By 2025, they want to have free mobility across Africa and a free trade union. That's unheard of. It's remarkable for such a poor region. So the trend is still towards trying to establish more connectivity across borders, even if we're still arbitrating 20th century style disputes that are lingering. And I think we'll get over them one by one.
I really love that view because it's grounded in reality and it is a truly optimistic view of where we are headed. Zooming in a little bit to think about early stage tech companies, which is what I at Betatron focus on. How do you see Asianization and the unwinding of colonialism impacting opportunities for early stage entrepreneurs and early stage companies?
No question. I mean, let's take the life cycle of an entrepreneur or a company. So where has the entrepreneur studied? They don't have to have gone to the UK or US anymore. They can be homegrown. And that also gives them a leg up in a way. They know the local market. They build those connections. They don't spend years abroad losing them. Now, you can have both. I've written a fair bit about repats. In a way, I was born in India technically, so I'm a repatriated Asian. There's lots of Bangladeshis going back to Bangladesh, lots of people from Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, obviously India, China, who have come back from the West. And so they bring know-how from wherever they are. Knowledge is a global enterprise. It's completely borderless. So that's one. Another is, where is your capital coming from? Think about the wealth that's been amassed in Asia. Some of your investors and the investors, obviously at the early stage, the seed stage, angels, are very often just private families. And there's so much wealth that has been built up. So you don't need to look to the validation necessarily of a Silicon Valley VC to get your start. There's a lot of angel money, seed money, friends and family, and it's getting more organized. Just in Singapore in the last 7 or 8 years, you could probably count 20 early stage funds that have popped up, perhaps more. I'm losing count at this point, and that's just in the last 8 years that I've lived here. So I think that's absolutely crucial. And then realizing that your market is the big growth market. Not that, again, you have to compete in a crowded marketplace in Western economies, but rather you are the place where they would like to be. So the opportunities for partnership and leapfrogging your technologies is also really strong. So I think that those are all examples of how Asianization is playing out in the early stage tech space.
Silicon Valley has enjoyed a culture of entrepreneurship, engineering talent, a supportive investor community that all came together to help it launch some of the world's most valuable companies. For Asia, do any specific regions stand out to you as viable contenders to Silicon Valley?
Well, one doesn't have to compete with Silicon Valley. One has to simply dominate one's own home market by whatever means it takes. The Japanese way, of course, of kind of strong bureaucratic centralization and state-supported or lenience towards family-owned mega conglomerates was the Japanese way. Vertically integrated supply chains, certainly a lot of R&D investment. Let's remember that China is not a democracy, but China has absolutely copied the Japanese model. Again, vertically integrated supply chains, industrial policy, strong subsidies. Every 5-year plan is around that. So it's perfectly conceivable. There is a bit of Silicon Valley in that, in the sense that, as the true story of Silicon Valley very much involves the US Department of Defense and so forth. So public-private collaboration is essential if you want to have that kind of scale of rapid modernization and technology integration the way Japan and China have done. Can other countries do it at a lower cost is the big question. India is extremely promising. India is still technically a poor country. And even without a large degree of federal support, the sheer human capital and the talent pool and the knowledge base, again, the global Indians as well as the Indian Indians that have made Bangalore and other cities now tech hubs, have now led to a situation where you have the India stack that's been taking shape across everything from data, payments, and all these other layers, identity, and so forth. Now, that's not something that needed to come from Silicon Valley. And when I look at the countries in Asia that are capable of becoming, you would call them like endogenous full stack ecosystems, it's rather impressive. So obviously the rich Asian countries already have it, Japan, Korea, China. India is getting there very quickly, and others will follow suit as they start to develop super apps and digital payments and digital identification. And again, who are they learning from? They're learning from each other, because you can't even do this in the US or Europe. Think about the data privacy concerns. Think about the legacy incumbent institutions like banks and others who want to prevent some of these things from happening. It's literally not going to happen. So Asia is already the leader in these areas. Why would you even look anywhere else?
There have been some amazing innovations or government policies implemented quite effectively across Asia that I've witnessed that include the national identity card. I think 100 million people in India alone became banked
Right.
through that process. Can you help us understand a little bit more about the impact of the national identity card, if it's specific to India or if that phenomenon is going to be seen in other countries as well?
There's no question that India, being a democracy, needed to go about it a certain way. There was concerns from start to finish around the Aadhaar program about how much data was going to be collected, how intrusive it might be, how much power should be given to independent agencies that were setting it up. Nandan Nilekani was a driving force behind all of this from the get-go. And so they were extremely careful to say, look, we're just beginning with identity, because there are millions of Indians who literally do not have identity. First name and last name, date of birth are not actually codified legally anywhere in any government office at the village level or otherwise. So we're going to leapfrog that and digitize it. So your thumbprint, your retina scan, whatever it is, becomes enough to match to a number. Once they did that, and they did it at lightning pace, what is really become equivalent to China, the largest population in the whole world, then they said, okay, we did it. It's trustworthy, minimal error, minimal breaches, this kind of thing. What can we build on top of that? How can we now do direct cash transfers to citizens, these crucial subsidies that so many Indians depend on? How can we then potentially use it for voting and other aspects of day-to-day life? And eventually what that morphs into is something, let's snowball and change geographies for a second. Ant Financial today, going blockchain and saying you're a small, mom and pop business, we're going to register you on a blockchain, you're going to have access to Ant Financial services. That is the end state. And you start with just poor villagers putting a thumbprint on a card, but it can rapidly become access to credit and financial services on the blockchain. I mean, India can easily do that soon. And demonetization has a very bad rap in India, given the way in which it was politically rolled out. But let's remember, there's no question that it's a cause worth pursuing. And India should go back and do it in a more transparent way. Now that everyone should have a mobile bank account, now you can do demonetization a lot better. So they got a little bit of the sequencing wrong, but the cause is the worthy one. And again, I think Asian, poorer Asian countries could move very quickly in that area. When we talk about Bangladesh, India, Thailand, Indonesia in particular, you're talking about countries that, according to the World Bank, have the highest share of GDP in the informal sector, in gray markets, black markets. In the case of Thailand, Arshad, it's estimated by the World Bank to be at 45 or 50%. So think about that for a minute. Thailand officially is an $800 or $900 billion economy, nearly $1 trillion. Now, just imagine what happens when you legalize that sector through digitization. And I call that Gojecification, given what's happened in Indonesia. Gojek is not a parallel system. It has become the system. It has become the system. And every single day, thousands, and in the short span of time as it launched, millions of people go from the informal to the formal economy. They're getting better wages. It's digital finance. They can be taxed more efficiently and so forth. So it's just phenomenal how much potential will be unlocked in the years ahead, taking this digital approach. And remember, for all the companies that you invest in as well, what's so important about picking those winners and scaling them? Well, there's still 2 billion poor people in Asia. There's still 2 billion poor people in this massive region. So the growth story is far from tapped out. There's still a lot of people that haven't been reached. And I'm so glad to see the pragmatic governments and the startup communities really wanting to pursue this cause of connecting the remaining couple of billion. That's why Google's project, next 3 billion, it's not headquartered in Silicon Valley, it's here in Asia.
Absolutely. I 100% agree that there is just so much work to be done in the region because there is such a dense population and there's so much poverty still today. When I think about challenges, one of the major challenges that I think is going to affect every part of the world, but certainly Asia with its reliance on water from the Himalayas or the vast coastlines, is climate change. What's your take on Asia's ability to adapt to climate change? How is the region going to fare?
This is the big blind spot, Arshad. I mean, I get asked this a lot. Poke a hole in your own story. And the two-word answer is climate change. Because we've got capital flows, talent flows, tech flows across Asia that's working out brilliantly. Remember that Southeast Asian companies are taking SoftBank money from Japan, Chinese money from Tencent, American money from Google, and they're really building. But climate change. Where is the international cooperation and flows of the critical technologies in that area? And it's lacking. Now, we have the tech innovators in the clean tech space in Asia. You've got Japan moving rapidly towards hydrogen, Korea doing the same with some cities. China is the world leader in solar and wind. But are we sufficiently retrofitting infrastructure and relocating coastal populations? Nowhere in the world are more urban coastal people threatened by rising sea levels. Bangladesh in particular, but Thailand too, Indonesia and elsewhere. Indonesia, they're talking about moving their capital. They probably will never actually do that. But why have stranded assets? That's what we call it in public finance. Stranded assets. Trillions of dollars have been spent on infrastructure in Asia in the last 30 years. Like you said, always hearing the construction and the cranes when you're in Dhaka. And that's everywhere in Asia. So Asia has led the world in infrastructure investment for the last 25 years, but trillions of dollars of it are going to be sunk, or they're going to be fried, or they're going to go up in smoke. So we need to have an advanced plan around what are the better future infrastructures to build. Gas. A lot of us are powered by natural gas in our daily lives here in our economies, our homes, and so forth. It costs so much more in Asia than the rest of the world. You got to do gas pipelines. Why do that at all? We've got solar power, tidal power, biomass power. We can do all of those things in this region. It's more portable, it's cheaper, more effective, more green, all those things. So I want to see a major Asian climate fund financed by Japan, by China, by this, subsidize the cost of every technology transfer to the poor industrializing countries so they can clean up, be less polluted, and be more self-sufficient in energy.
My take on it is that the pandemic showed us we're dealing with two realities at once. One is that the world is largely unprepared for predictable major problems. The other is that we were able to come up with vaccines in record time, within a year. I think when we absolutely have to, we probably are better able today to act quickly to make meaningful change than at any other point in history. So I remain optimistic despite the risks.
Oh, yeah. And that's what I call technocracy. Can Asia be the region that blends democracy and technocracy? Now, 2 points there. First, most Asians live in democracies. Most Asians do not live in China. 1.4 billion people live in China. A lot of them are obviously loyal to their state, but certainly might prefer a different type of government if they were allowed to freely choose. That said, the majority of the Asian population does not live in China and lives in democratic states. They may be flawed democracies, they may be frail democracies, but they are democracies. Secondly, however, even in a democracy, Asians are pragmatic. They want to see results. They want leaders who have a long-term vision and a plan for modernization, for uplifting, reducing poverty, building infrastructure, promoting education, and so forth. And that's why you see the popularity of people like Modi or Duterte. Now, these are not likable people in many ways. I'm being politically correct here, but we know what their flaws and their warts are, and they're awful. However, if you cannot see them through the eyes of a poor person who has witnessed nothing but deprivation for generations and see how finally they identify with leaders who are saying, none of this. We want all kids in school. We want streets that are clean. We want more support for farmers, all of this kind of stuff. That's why Duterte's campaign has been build, build, build. It's really simple. You want to get elected in Asia, in any Asian country, for any position, from the town council to prime minister, just say build, build, build. And that's what's been happening. And I do support that. And that's technocratic, saying what is in the long-term utilitarian interest of the entire national population, and I'm going to do it. So what you find is Asian populations will give a long leash, a long shelf life, a long runway, I should say, to their leaders. in order to get something done. Ideally, not rotating prime ministers or presidents every 2 or 3 years. Again, I'm a believer in that if they're obviously pursuing the right vision. And that's that balance between democracy and technocracy. And technocracy is what speaks to your point, Arshad, about being effective, getting things done. And deploying vaccines is obviously one of the most crucial things and one key data point in that regard.
The story that I've heard all along for the last maybe 15 years has been Asia's growth is all about China's growth. But is that still the truth, or is there more to the story in terms of Asia's growth? And where do you see, in terms of specific countries, where do you see opportunity for a lot of growth in the next few years?
Great point. So to me, if you look at Asia's growth, it doesn't start with China. China is not the beginning or the end. China is the middle. The story begins with Japan in the 50s, and then it's the tiger economies that came on the back of that: Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And then China came on as the third wave of growth starting in the 80s and 90s. And now what you have is the fourth wave of growth, which is very much South Asia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia, these contiguous geographies, these two subregions. Combined, that's 2.5 billion people. Every single one of those dozen countries is younger than China in median age, with the sole exception of Thailand, which has this older population. And of course, pre-pandemic had very fast growth rates, anywhere from 4 to 7, 8%. Southeast Asia alone was catching up to China in FDI, has a larger GDP than India. So you cannot talk about Asia and neglect the 2.5 billion people in the fast-growing economies of South and Southeast Asia. It's taken a long time for people to wake up to that story, but there's no question that A, the story has begun, B, it continues to take off despite the pandemic, and C, it represents a coherent next wave of Asian growth. So 10 years from now, I'm sure when we look back at the Asian economic mega system, we're not going to be saying it's all about China.
Asia is a pretty complicated place to do business because every country has its own language. There are different rules, different power structures. What's your advice to investors like myself trying to navigate that world?
Yeah, exactly what makes Asian countries unattractive to certain major global portfolio capital investors, because they're saying, small markets, currency controls, inflation, all this kind of stuff, and can't get my money out and so forth. On the other hand, for an entrepreneur, it's like, this is great. A somewhat protected market, I can control this turf and build out from here. So what you see already is that whether it's incumbent industrial players or startups have done really well in payments and e-commerce and logistics within their borders. And if they really build up, then they can move across them. So C Group, Grab, and so forth are all good examples of this. And I think that we'll have more and more of that. AirAsia, in many ways, is sort of the original story of a border crossing company, the airline, when there just wasn't sufficient regional integration and regulatory harmonization. Now in the public markets, you've got a stock connect kinds of phenomenon where you can have dual listings across the region, buy and sell equities from one exchange in another, and so forth. So we're getting there in terms of the regulatory harmonization. But sure, if you're at the early stage, obviously look to dominate the local market first. Indonesia, as a case in point, is still deficient in literally just about everything. And you're talking about over 200 million people. Same thing goes, of course, for Bangladesh. So 100 million populations, such as the Philippines or Vietnam, is nothing to sneeze at. Obviously, having local teams is critical, but then the cross-border cooperation. We see this a lot with companies headquartered in Singapore, but they've got their user interface development in Vietnam, and there's some tech coming out of Taiwan and deploying in Indonesia, this kind of thing. So on the one hand, borders can be good to protect or control a market. On the other hand, it obviously can cause a bit of friction when you're really trying to scale.
Well, I think we're coming up on time now. And Parag, I want to thank you for your time. This has been really illuminating, always really great to talk to you. I always come away optimistic about the region, optimistic about the future generally. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, Arshad. And you don't look a day older than when we met 20 years ago.
I think it's a combination of good luck and good genes. Thanks for listening today. If you want to know more about Betatron, where we invest in fast-growing B2B startups throughout Asia, visit our website at betatron.co. I'm your host, Arshad Chowdhury. Find me on Twitter at ArshadGC, where I'd love to hear your ideas about guests and topics related to investing in Asia.